In the summer of 1987, renovators tearing down an abandoned farmhouse in the Blue Ridge foothills of Western Virginia made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the small community of Millfield Hollow. Hidden beneath rotting floorboards in what appeared to be a root cellar, they found a sealed wooden chest containing documents that should never have existed. 2 marriage certificates, both dated September the 15th, 1923, both bearing the name Jeremiah Halbrook as groom. The brides were listed as Constance May Thornberry and Prudence May Thornberry, twin sisters, born on the same day, married to the same man, in ceremonies performed just hours apart. But these weren't the only secrets buried in that chest. What emerged from those yellowed papers would expose one of Appalachia's most disturbing family dynasties, a bloodline twisted by greed, isolation, and a patriarch's obsession with keeping his legacy pure. Before we descend into this mountain nightmare, subscribe and leave a comment telling us which Appalachian legend haunts you most. Your engagement keeps these buried histories from disappearing forever. The first document in that chest was a birth certificate from Millfield County, dated March the 3rd, 1905. Constance May and Prudence May Thornberry, daughters of Samuel and Martha Thornberry, born within minutes of each other in a cabin that still stands today, though locals cross the street rather than walk past its sagging porch. According to parish records from the Mount Calvary Baptist Church, the twins were baptized together that spring, but even then, something set them apart from other children in the hollow. Reverend Elias Whitmore's personal journals, discovered in the church basement in 1994, contained disturbing entries about the Thornberry girls. He wrote of their unnatural closeness, describing how they seemed to share thoughts and finish each other's sentences in ways that made the congregation uncomfortable. More troubling were his observations about their physical development. Both girls matured identically, developing the same mannerisms, the same way of tilting their heads, even the same small scar above their left eyebrows from what their mother claimed was a shared fall. But Reverend Whitmore's most chilling entry, dated December 1920, reveals the true horror of their situation. The Thornberry twins have caught the attention of old Jeremiah Halbrook. I fear what that mountain devil has planned for those poor girls. Their father owes him money, and in these hills, debts to the Halbrooks are paid in more than coin. To understand the nightmare that befell the Thornberry twins, we must first examine the man who would claim them both. Jeremiah Halbrook, patriarch of what locals called the cursed bloodline of Millfield Hollow. Census records from 1920 show Jeremiah as a 45-year-old widower, owner of nearly 800 acres of prime mountain land, and operator of the only general store for 30 miles in any direction. But these official documents tell only a fraction of his story. Jeremiah's first wife, Rebecca Halbrook née Crenshaw, had died under suspicious circumstances in 1919, just 2 years after bearing him twin sons, Ezekiel and Zachariah. The coroner's report, signed by Dr. Marcus Penfield, lists the cause of death as complications from childbirth, but handwritten notes in the margins tell a different tale. Dr. Penfield observed unusual bruising consistent with prolonged restraint, and evidence of malnutrition despite the family's obvious wealth. More disturbing was his private notation. Patient exhibited signs of prolonged psychological distress, refused to speak except to beg that her children be kept apart from him. Rebecca's fears were well-founded. By 1921, Jeremiah had already begun grooming his twin sons for roles in his twisted vision of dynasty building. School attendance records show both boys were withdrawn from the county school after just 2 years, with Jeremiah claiming they would receive private education at home. What this education entailed would become clear years later, when FBI investigators uncovered Jeremiah's meticulous breeding logs, written in his own hand and stored in a locked cabinet behind his store's false wall. These logs, spanning from 1921 to 1934, reveal Jeremiah's obsession with what he called bloodline purity. He had mapped out family trees going back 5 generations, identifying which local families carried what he deemed desirable traits: physical strength, mathematical aptitude, resistance to common diseases. More chilling were his detailed notes on local twin births, which he seemed to view as genetic goldmines. The Thornberry sisters feature prominently in these logs from the time they turned 16, with Jeremiah noting their symmetrical development and proven fertility indicators. Samuel Thornberry's financial troubles began in the winter of 1922, when a series of harsh storms destroyed most of his tobacco crop. With no way to pay his family's mounting debts, he turned to the only man in the hollow with ready cash, Jeremiah Halbrook. The loan agreement, preserved in that hidden chest, reveals the true cost of Samuel's desperation. The document, written in Jeremiah's careful script, outlined terms that went far beyond money. In exchange for $200, enough to save the Thornberry farm, Samuel agreed to what the contract euphemistically called future considerations regarding family alliances. The contract's most disturbing clause stated that should Samuel default on the loan, the borrower's twin daughters shall be made available for marriage arrangements deemed suitable by the lender. Samuel defaulted within 6 months. What happened next is documented in a series of increasingly frantic letters from Martha Thornberry to her sister in Charleston, letters that were found sewn into the lining of an old quilt donated to the County Historical Society in 1989. Martha's correspondence reveals a mother's growing horror as she watched her husband negotiate away their daughters' futures. "Jeremiah came by again today," Martha wrote in February 1923. "He brought that boy of his, Ezekiel, and made him sit in our parlor while he discussed arrangements with Samuel. The boy never took his eyes off the girls, and Constance started crying for no reason she could name. Prudence just stared back at him with the strangest look, like she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't." By summer of 1923, the arrangements were finalized. But what Jeremiah proposed wasn't a simple marriage between one of his sons and one of the twins. His plan was far more elaborate and infinitely more disturbing. Dr. Penfield's medical journals, discovered in his grandson's attic in 2003, provide a clinical perspective on the events leading up to the dual wedding ceremony. Jeremiah had requested what he called fitness examinations for both twins, examinations that Dr. Penfield reluctantly performed at the Halbrook home in August 1923. "I was summoned to examine the Thornberry girls under circumstances I found highly irregular," Dr. Penfield wrote. Jeremiah insisted on being present during the examinations, along with his son Ezekiel. The girls were clearly terrified, clinging to each other throughout the procedure. What troubled me most was not their fear, but Ezekiel's intense attention to my findings. He asked detailed questions about their anatomy, their health, their capacity for childbearing. When I asked why he needed such information, Jeremiah simply smiled and said, "Knowledge is power, Doctor, and power runs in families." Dr. Penfield's notes reveal other disturbing details about the pre-wedding period. Both twins had begun experiencing what he called sympathetic symptoms. When one sister felt pain, the other would cry out. When one fell ill with a fever, the other would develop identical symptoms within hours. Most unsettling was their shared sleepwalking, which began in late August and always led them to the same destination, the front porch of the Halbrook house, where they would stand motionless until dawn. The wedding preparations themselves were handled with military precision. Jeremiah had commissioned 2 identical wedding dresses from a seamstress in the county seat, specifying that every detail must be matched exactly. The ceremonies were to be held at the Halbrook property, with Reverend Whitmore officiating both services. But there was one detail about the wedding plans that even the Reverend found too disturbing to record in his official church registry. Witness statements collected by county investigators in 1955, the first ceremony began at dawn, with Constance May Thornberry wed to Ezekiel Halbrook in the front parlor of the family home. The second ceremony, uniting Prudence May to Jeremiah himself, took place at sunset in the same room. But these weren't separate marriages. They were 2 halves of a single, twisted ritual. Reverend Whitmore's private journals reveal the true horror of what he was forced to perform that day. Jeremiah had insisted that both ceremonies use identical vows, identical rings, and identical witnesses. More disturbing, he required that the first bride remain present for the second ceremony, and that the second bride witness the first. As Whitmore wrote, it was as if he was marrying both girls to both men simultaneously, creating some unholy bond that violated every principle of Christian marriage. The wedding photographs, also found in that buried chest, show the full scope of Jeremiah's perversion. In image after image, the 2 brides stand side by side, their faces blank and identical, while Jeremiah and Ezekiel flank them possessively. But the most disturbing photograph was taken after both ceremonies, showing all 4 figures arranged around a small table bearing a document that neither reverend nor witnesses were allowed to examine. That document, preserved by some miracle in the sealed chest, was Jeremiah's marriage covenant, a contract outlining the specific roles and responsibilities of his new family unit. The covenant established that both wives would live in the Halbrook house under Jeremiah's authority. that any children born would be considered offspring of both marriages, regardless of biological paternity, and that the twins would continue to share all aspects of their lives, including what the document euphemistically called marital duties. The Halbrook family Bible, discovered during a 1978 estate sale, contains handwritten entries that chronicle the early months of this nightmarish arrangement. Jeremiah's careful script records births, deaths, and what he called covenant adjustments, changes to the family structure that became increasingly bizarre as time passed. Within 2 months of the double wedding, both twins were pregnant. Jeremiah's entries note this as proof of divine favor on our pure bloodline, but Dr. Penfield's medical records tell a different story. His examination notes from November 1923 describe both women as suffering from severe malnutrition, unexplained bruising, and what he termed nervous exhaustion. More troubling was his observation that both pregnancies appeared to be progressing identically, as if the twins' bodies were somehow synchronizing even their reproductive cycles. The births, which occurred within hours of each other in June 1924, brought new horrors to light. Both twins delivered boys, but the infants bore such striking resemblances that even family members couldn't distinguish between them. Jeremiah named them Abel and Cain, and his Bible entries suggest he viewed them not as individual children, but as components of a single entity designed to continue his bloodline experiment. Local midwife Emmeline Foster, who assisted with both births, later told investigators that the experience haunted her for the rest of her life. In a statement given to County Sheriff Thomas Brennan in 1954, she described the unnatural synchronization between the twins during labor. When one would have a contraction, the other would cry out at the exact same moment. When Constance's water broke, Prudence doubled over in pain, though her time hadn't come yet. It was like watching one woman give birth in 2 bodies. But the horror didn't end with the births. Foster's statement reveals that Jeremiah had insisted both infants be placed in a single crib, and that both mothers nursed both babies without regard to biological parentage. He kept saying they were all one family now, Foster recalled, and that the boys needed to learn their place in the covenant from the very beginning. By 1926, Jeremiah's experiment had evolved into something even more sinister. County tax records show he had begun acquiring additional property throughout Millfield Hollow, specifically targeting families with young daughters. His method was always the same: extend credit during hard times, then collect payment in the form of marriage contracts when the debts came due. The Henderson twins, Mary and Margaret, became his next targets in 1927. Like the Thornberrys before them, the Henderson family fell into debt to Jeremiah during a particularly harsh winter. And like Samuel Thornberry, James Henderson found himself signing over his daughters' futures to satisfy his obligations to the Halbrook patriarch. FBI files from a 1952 investigation into unusual marriage practices in rural Virginia contain dozens of documents related to Jeremiah's expanding operation. Agent Robert Daniels noted that by 1928, Jeremiah had engineered marriages between multiple sets of twins and various members of the growing Halbrook clan. What made these arrangements particularly disturbing was their systematic nature. Jeremiah was selecting breeding pairs based on specific genetic traits, maintaining detailed records of each pairing's offspring, and planning future marriages that would concentrate these traits within his bloodline. The FBI files also contain photographs taken during the investigation, images that were deemed too disturbing for public release. These photos show the interior of the Halbrook house, which had been modified to accommodate Jeremiah's growing collection of covenant families. Rooms had been subdivided with makeshift walls, creating a maze-like interior where privacy was impossible, and every aspect of daily life could be monitored. Most disturbing were the modifications to the basement, which had been converted into what investigators described as a communal nursery, where all the children born into the covenant were raised collectively. The first sign that Jeremiah's experiment was beginning to unravel came in the spring of 1929, when Prudence May Halbrook simply vanished from the family compound. According to Jeremiah's Bible entries, she had been called to serve a higher purpose, but local residents began whispering about more sinister possibilities. Dr. Penfield's final examination of the Halbrook household, conducted at the request of county authorities, provides disturbing insights into Prudence's state of mind before her disappearance. His notes describe a woman who had become virtually catatonic, responding to questions only with blank stares, and seeming to recognize neither her husband nor her sister. Most troubling was his observation that Constance had begun exhibiting identical symptoms, as if Prudence's mental deterioration was somehow contagious. I observed the remaining twin, Constance, displaying what I can only describe as phantom behaviors, Dr. Penfield wrote. She would reach for objects that weren't there, respond to voices only she could hear, and frequently hold lengthy conversations with her absent sister. When I asked where Prudence had gone, Constance simply smiled and said, "She's still here. She's always here." The local sheriff's investigation into Prudence's disappearance was hampered by Jeremiah's political influence and the reluctance of witnesses to speak openly. But handwritten notes found in Sheriff Brennan's personal effects after his death in 1967 reveal the true scope of what investigators suspected. Brennan believed that Prudence hadn't simply disappeared. He thought she had been murdered, and that her body was somewhere on the Halbrook property. Jeremiah's story keeps changing, Brennan wrote in his private notes. First he said she ran off with a traveling salesman. Then he claimed she had a breakdown and was sent to an asylum in Richmond. When I pressed for documentation, he became hostile and threatened to have me removed from office. But I've seen the look in his eyes when I mentioned Prudence's name. That's not the look of a man worried about a runaway wife. It's the look of a man hiding murder. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: the children born into Jeremiah's covenant marriages. By 1930, several of these children had reached an age where they could provide coherent testimony about life inside the Halbrook compound, and what they revealed was far worse than anyone had imagined. 8-year-old Abel Halbrook, son of either Constance or Prudence, paternity had been deliberately obscured, was the first to speak to authorities. His statement, preserved in the county courthouse files, describes a household ruled by fear and dominated by rituals that served Jeremiah's obsession with bloodline purity. According to Abel, the children were subjected to daily lessons that included detailed instruction in genealogy, mandatory physical examinations, and psychological conditioning designed to prepare them for their future roles in expanding the covenant. But Abel's most disturbing testimony concerned what he called the ceremony room, a locked chamber in the house's basement where Jeremiah conducted rituals that the children were forbidden to discuss. Abel's description of strange chanting, burning candles, and offerings to the bloodline spirits suggested that Jeremiah's genetic experiments had taken on religious overtones, transforming his breeding program into a form of cult worship. Other children provided equally disturbing testimony. 9-year-old Sarah Henderson, daughter of the Henderson twins, described a household where individual identity was actively suppressed. Grandfather Jeremiah said we weren't separate people, she told investigators. He said we were all parts of one big family soul, and that we had to learn to think and feel as one. When one of us got punished, we all got punished. When one of us cried, we all had to cry. The children's testimony also shed light on Prudence's fate. Several reported having seen Aunt Prudence in the basement ceremony room long after her official disappearance, but their descriptions suggested they were viewing her body rather than a living person. 10-year-old Marcus Halbrook told investigators that during one of Jeremiah's rituals, he had seen Aunt Prudence sleeping in a special box that grandfather said was keeping her safe until she was ready to come back. Armed with the children's testimony and growing pressure from state authorities, Sheriff Brennan finally obtained a search warrant for the Halbrook property in November 1930. What investigators found in the basement of the family home confirmed their worst suspicions and revealed horrors that went far beyond simple murder. The ceremony room, Abel had described, was a carefully constructed shrine to Jeremiah's twisted vision of genetic perfection. The walls were covered with family trees, photographs of multiple generations of twins, and what appeared to be breeding charts mapping out future marriages within the covenant. At the center of the room sat an ornate casket containing the perfectly preserved remains of Prudence May Halbrook. But Prudence wasn't simply dead. She had been mummified using techniques that Dr. Penfield described as primitive but effective. Her body showed no signs of violence, leading investigators to conclude that she had died of natural causes, possibly as a result of the psychological trauma inflicted by her forced marriage and confinement. What made her preservation so disturbing was evidence that Jeremiah had been using her remains as part of his ritual ceremonies, treating her corpse as a sacred relic that would ensure the covenant's continued success. The basement excavation also revealed the remains of 4 infants, all bearing signs of severe genetic abnormalities consistent with intensive inbreeding. Coroner's reports identified these as children born to various covenant marriages who had died within days of birth, their deaths carefully concealed from outside authorities. Jeremiah had preserved these remains as well, incorporating them into his shrine as what his journal entries called blessed sacrifices to the pure bloodline. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of Jeremiah's future breeding plans, written in meticulous detail and stored in a locked cabinet beside Prudence's casket. These documents outlined his intention to arrange marriages between his growing collection of genetically selected children, creating what he envisioned as a master race of mountain dwellers who would eventually dominate the entire region. The plans included detailed provisions for eliminating impure offspring and selecting only the most genetically advantageous traits for future generations. Jeremiah Halbrook's trial began in February 1931 and quickly became a sensation that attracted reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago. The proceedings, which lasted 6 weeks, exposed not only the full scope of his crimes, but also the complicity of various local officials who had turned a blind eye to his activities in exchange for political and financial favors. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Marsh, painted a picture of systematic abuse that had gone unchecked for nearly a decade. Witness after witness testified to Jeremiah's manipulation of desperate families, his creation of fraudulent marriage contracts, and his systematic psychological abuse of the women and children trapped in his covenant. The most powerful testimony came from Constance Halbrook, who had been rescued from the compound during the initial raid. Constance's testimony, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, revealed the full horror of life under Jeremiah's control. She described years of physical and sexual abuse, forced pregnancies, and psychological conditioning designed to break down her individual identity. Most heartbreaking was her description of watching her twin sister's gradual mental deterioration and eventual death, events that she blamed on the unnatural stress of their shared captivity. "He told us we weren't people anymore," Constance testified. "He said we were vessels for his pure bloodline, and that our only purpose was to produce children who would carry on his legacy. When Prudence couldn't take it anymore and started talking to people who weren't there, he said she was being blessed with visions. When she died in her sleep, he said she had transcended to become a guardian spirit for the covenant. He kept her body so she could watch over the rest of us." The defense, led by Richmond attorney Charles Whitman, attempted to portray Jeremiah as a man driven to extremes by his desire to preserve Appalachian culture and bloodlines. They argued that his actions, while unconventional, were motivated by legitimate concerns about genetic diversity and family preservation, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on charges ranging from fraud and kidnapping to involuntary manslaughter. Jeremiah was sentenced to life in prison, but his incarceration did little to undo the damage he had inflicted. The surviving members of his covenant were scattered across the state, many requiring extensive medical and psychological treatment. Several of the children born into the compound never fully recovered from their early conditioning, and some spent their entire lives in state institutions. What makes the Halbrook case particularly disturbing is the evidence that Jeremiah's influence survived his imprisonment. FBI files from the 1950s contain reports of suspicious marriage patterns in rural Virginia communities, patterns that bore striking similarities to Jeremiah's original covenant structure. Investigators suspected that some of the children who had escaped the compound were continuing their grandfather's work in other locations. The most concrete evidence of this continuing influence came in 1947, when authorities in neighboring Rockbridge County discovered a similar operation run by Marcus Halbrook, one of the twins born into the covenant in 1924. Marcus had established what he called a traditional family community in an isolated mountain valley, where multiple generations of carefully selected families lived under his patriarchal authority. The Rockbridge County investigation revealed that Marcus had maintained detailed records of his community's genetics, just as his grandfather had done. These records showed systematic intermarriage between related families, genetic tracking of desirable traits, and elimination of individuals deemed genetically inferior. Most disturbing was evidence that Marcus had been in contact with similar communities in other states, suggesting that Jeremiah's vision of genetic purification had spread far beyond the mountains of Virginia. Federal investigators ultimately broke up Marcus's operation in 1952, but not before he had successfully established what appeared to be a network of isolated communities practicing selective breeding programs based on Jeremiah's original principles. The FBI estimated that by 1955, there might have been as many as 12 such communities operating in remote areas across the southeastern United States. The Halbrook name disappeared from public records after 1955, but the influence of Jeremiah's genetic experiments may have survived in more subtle forms. Genetic studies conducted by university researchers in the 1980s identified several Appalachian communities with unusually high rates of inherited traits that matched those Jeremiah had been trying to concentrate in his covenant bloodlines. Dr. Margaret Chen, a geneticist at Virginia Commonwealth University who studied these communities in 1987, noted patterns that seemed too systematic to be natural. We found isolated populations with remarkably consistent physical characteristics, intellectual abilities, and disease resistances, she reported. The level of genetic uniformity suggested intensive selective breeding over multiple generations. While we found no direct evidence of coercion, the statistical probability of such consistency occurring naturally was virtually zero. Dr. Chen's research was quietly discontinued after she received threats from unknown individuals warning her to leave the mountain families alone. Her research notes, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in 2003, suggest she had identified genetic markers that could be traced directly back to the original Halbrook Covenant families. More troubling were her preliminary findings about the psychological characteristics common to these communities. Her interviews revealed populations with unusually high rates of shared psychological traits, identical phobias, similar response patterns to stress, and what she described as group consciousness behaviors, reminiscent of the conditioning described by survivors of Jeremiah's compound. It was as if entire communities had been programmed to think and respond in predetermined ways, Dr. Chen noted in her final report. Individual personality seemed less important than group conformity, and resistance to outside influence was remarkably strong. When I asked about family histories, I consistently received identical responses from multiple individuals, as if they had been coached to provide specific answers. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Halbrook case is how systematically evidence has disappeared over the decades since Jeremiah's conviction. Court records from his trial were destroyed in a clerical accident in 1965. The FBI files on his case and the subsequent investigation into related communities were classified in 1958 and have never been declassified. Dr. Penfield's complete medical records were lost when his former office building burned under suspicious circumstances in 1971. Even the original evidence that sparked this investigation, the documents found in the sealed chest beneath the abandoned farmhouse, has vanished. The Millfield County Historical Society claimed to have acquired these materials for preservation, but when researchers attempted to examine them in 1995, they were told the documents had been misplaced during a recent reorganization. Subsequent attempts to locate any trace of the original evidence have been unsuccessful. This systematic disappearance of evidence suggests that someone, or some organization, has been actively working to erase the historical record of Jeremiah's crimes and their ongoing consequences. Local historians who have attempted to research the Halbrook case report harassment, threats, and mysterious break-ins at their offices. Several have received anonymous warnings to leave the old families alone or face unspecified consequences. The most chilling incident occurred in 1998 when genealogist Rebecca Morrison was researching Halbrook family connections for a university dissertation. After announcing her intention to trace the bloodlines of Covenant survivors, Morrison received a package containing photographs of her children taken outside their school, along with a note reading, "Some family trees are better left unexamined." She immediately abandoned her research and moved her family to another state. Today, more than 90 years after Jeremiah Halbrook's arrest, the mountains of Western Virginia still hold secrets that may never be fully revealed. Local residents in Millfield Hollow speak in whispers about the old families who live in the remote hollows and valleys, families that intermarry with suspicious frequency and maintain traditions that outsiders are never allowed to witness. Recent census data reveals anomalies in these communities that demographers struggle to explain. Birth rates remain unusually high despite economic hardship. Infant mortality is far below regional averages, and genetic disorders that should be common in isolated populations occur at surprisingly low rates. These statistics suggest that someone is still making systematic decisions about who reproduces with whom, decisions based on the same genetic principles that drove Jeremiah's original covenant. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from social workers and medical professionals who have attempted to provide services to these isolated communities. They describe encounters with families who seem to share not just physical characteristics, but behavioral patterns, speech rhythms, and even facial expressions that appear too uniform to be natural. Children in these families often speak in unison when answering questions, and adults defer to unseen authorities when making decisions about medical care or education. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a pediatrician who worked in rural Virginia from 1985 to 2010, documented dozens of encounters with families that exhibited these unusual characteristics. Her private notes describe children who seemed programmed rather than raised, parents who referred all decisions to unnamed elders, and medical histories that had clearly been falsified to hide genetic relationships between supposedly unrelated individuals. I began to suspect that I was witnessing the continuation of something that officially ended decades ago, Dr. Blackwood wrote in her retirement memoir. The level of genetic control, the systematic behavior modification, the absolute authority of invisible patriarchs, it all pointed to organized breeding programs that were still active in the most remote mountain communities. The true scope of Jeremiah Halbrook's legacy may never be fully understood. Too much evidence has vanished, too many witnesses have been silenced, and too many officials have shown a disturbing willingness to look the other way when confronted with evidence of ongoing genetic manipulation in isolated communities. What we do know is that the twin sisters who were forced into marriage with the Halbrook men were just the beginning of a program that may have produced hundreds of genetically selected offspring over multiple generations. These individuals, raised from birth to prioritize bloodline purity over individual freedom, may have established communities throughout Appalachia where Jeremiah's vision continues to shape human reproduction and social organization. The most chilling possibility is that Jeremiah's program succeeded in ways that even he never imagined. By creating isolated populations with carefully controlled genetics and systematic psychological conditioning, he may have established self-perpetuating communities that continue his work without any central authority. These communities would be nearly invisible to outside investigation, appearing to be simply traditional mountain families, while actually representing the continuation of one of America's most disturbing eugenic experiments. Federal law enforcement agencies continue to receive occasional reports of suspicious activity in remote Appalachian communities. Reports of arranged marriages between underage cousins, systematic isolation of children from outside influences, and patriarchal authorities who exercise absolute control over reproduction and family formation. But these reports are rarely investigated thoroughly, partly due to jurisdictional complications, and partly due to what appears to be active obstruction by individuals who may themselves be products of Jeremiah's program. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where mountain mist shrouds secrets that span generations, some bloodlines carry more than genetic material. They carry the weight of a twisted vision that refused to die with its creator. The Thornberry twins, Constance and Prudence, became unwilling participants in an experiment that treated human beings as breeding stock, their individual identities sacrificed to serve one man's obsession with genetic perfection. Though Jeremiah Halbrook died in prison in 1943, the echoes of his covenant still whisper through isolated communities where family trees grow in carefully controlled patterns, where children learn to value bloodline purity above personal freedom, and where the distinction between voluntary tradition and systematic manipulation has been deliberately obscured. In these forgotten corners of America, the twin sisters' nightmare continues in forms so subtle and systematic that they have become indistinguishable from culture itself. Their story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous forms of evil are often those that present themselves as preservation of tradition, and that the mountains that hide these communities also hide truths that some would prefer remain buried forever.